Andy Rumbach. And Andy, as you're sharing your screen, I'm going to share your bio. Andy Rumbach is a senior fellow in the Housing and Communities Division at the Urban Institute, where he co-leads the Climate and Communities Practice area. His work focuses on how natural hazards, disasters, and climate change affect U.S. communities, with an emphasis on affordable housing, land use policy, and post-disaster recovery. He has published widely in leading academic journals and serves on multiple editorial boards. Before joining Urban, Rumbach was a tenured professor of urban planning at Texas A&M University and previously at the University of Colorado, Denver. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to you, Andy.
Thank you, Justin. Thanks, everyone. And coming from DC, where reflective roofs are part of the building code. And so I just had my roof replaced with a reflective roof, and it was interesting having those conversations. So I wanted to share today, thinking about the topic and thinking about the group, I wanted to share some research that the Urban Institute did alongside our partners in Boulder County, Colorado. And this is energy efficiency of a different kind. This is an example where the state and the local governments in Colorado were able to design an energy efficiency program that turned out to be a pretty big success in a post-fire context, and so maybe very relevant for you all out there who are thinking about future disaster preparedness and how energy might fit into that picture. So a little bit about the Marshall Fire, if you don't remember. It was it was a very unusual event in Colorado because it happened just before New Year's in the middle of the winter. There was more than 100-mile-per-hour winds that came through the Colorado Front Range, and a grass fire led to one of the biggest suburban fires in U.S. history, kind of a small version and a precursor to the Los Angeles wildfires. In very short time, only a few hours, Colorado lost about 1,250 homes. Many of them were in, if you've ever been to Boulder, the city of Boulder, many of them were in a couple of suburbs next to Boulder, Louisville, and Superior, as well as some homes out in the wildland urban interface. And so together, this was about $2 billion in damage. It's the most expensive fire in Colorado history. And most of the homes that burned down, especially the two that were in the suburban areas, these were built about 20 or 30 years ago. And so immediately from an energy perspective, Boulder County saw that the rebuild presented a real opportunity to transform the building stock and to potentially achieve some really significant reductions in both greenhouse gas emissions, but also in overall energy demand. And so that was originally, and there's a little bit of backstory I'll cover. The idea was that the codes themselves would take care of this because it would require people to build back to higher energy standards. But very quickly, the story became one about underinsurance. And this has become an issue everywhere in the country for a bunch of different reasons, including inflation and the kind of COVID surge in material and infrastructure costs. But in the Marshall Fire context, about 75% of homes that were destroyed, the homeowners were underinsured. About 25% overall were severely underinsured, which means that they had coverage below 75% of the replacement costs. And so you had price and cost sensitivity quickly become the dominant characteristic of the recovery, people being really concerned about being able to afford the recovery and worried that they might not be able to rebuild their homes. So energy codes, strangely enough, became sort of the lightning rod politically of the recovery. I can't prove it, but I believe this is probably the first and only street protest around an energy code in American history where people actually brought signs out into the streets talking about a clean energy code. But the story is that all three of these jurisdictions that were impacted had either just adopted new very high energy standards or were about to adopt very high energy standards, the 2021 IECC code with some significant supplementation of net zero amendments. They were meant to be one of the most progressive land use codes in the country in terms of building to net zero ready and near zero emissions homes. And so this quickly became a very large issue because those codes were passed with the expectation that people would slowly have to rebuild to those codes as they did new development. All of a sudden, 1,200 or 1,300 homeowners were faced with the prospect of having to rebuild to these more expensive codes. And that led to really significant backlash in the community. Long story short, they ended up rolling the codes back and allowing people to rebuild to an earlier code. And so they knew leaders in Boulder County knew that they were no longer going to be able to rely on the mandate to get those energy savings. They needed to design a program that was voluntary. And that's the origin story of this program that we're talking about. And this is just a quote from a resident kind of articulating this point that to expect people who have nothing to build these environmental codes on top of everything else is just too much. And this is one of the most environmentally progressive communities in the country. And so it's not as though there was pushback just on the basis of clean energy or climate goals. In reality, it was entirely around the cost issue that people were concerned. So that led to the creation of the Rebuilding Better program, which was a collaboration between all of the local governments who were involved, along with the major utility in Colorado and the state government. And so effectively, they joined together in a pretty short period of time and created a program where they wanted to incentivize rebuilding to higher energy standards rather than mandating it. And there were effectively large rebates that came along with rebuilding. And they had a tiered approach to incentives where the higher the energy standard you rebuild to, the more rebates you could actually earn. Crucially, they also paired those rebates with a really hands-on technical assistance. There's a bunch of examples of this, but one of them is that they hired one of the leading construction figures in the community who had built many of the homes originally, and they hired him to come and effectively be a one-on-one consultant to all of the homeowners who are entering the recovery process and talk them through these issues. But in a bunch of other ways, they created very high-touch situations where individual homeowners could talk with them and talk about their options before committing to an energy plan. And so this is just representing the tiered approach to the incentives. As you can see, just rebuilding to the 2021 IECC would be a $7,500 incentive. But by the time you got all the way up to the highest standards, which is a passive house standard, you could actually earn close to $40,000 in rebates. And so these were among or the most generous energy incentives really anywhere in the country. And ultimately, I think that you'll see in our the data that we collected that became a really key part of this program overall. And so long story short, they had incredible success with this program. And these numbers are only as of October when we published our report. I need to do a new poll with the county to see where they're at today. But in October, 70% of homes had rebuilt to higher than mandated energy standard. The only other comparable data we pulled from the Tubbs fire in California back in 2017, and they only had a 6% success rate with a similar program. And so incredible success, a different context to be fair, but they learned a lot from the Tubbs fire experience. And the goal of this report is to then share what they learned forward so that other jurisdictions can have even more success if they design a similar program. And so this is just a breakdown of where people actually rebuilt to. Again, as of October, you saw that about 30% of people rebuilt to the minimum standard, which is still a high standard, is the 2018 IACC codes, but fully 40% more rebuilt to 2021. And then you had a number of folks who rebuilt to higher than that, including Energy Star 3.2, zero energy ready homes. And then you even had some of these passive homes that were built. I think the recovery after the Marshall Fire doubled the number of passive homes overall in the state of Colorado, and I think they have the most out of any state other than California. Okay, so we wanted to learn from this program, and so we partnered with the office that designed it and administered it, and we did interviews with a lot of folks who were involved on the government side and on the utility side to understand, okay, what were the key lessons, both positive and negative? What would they want to share with other folks like yourselves and put out into the world? And so I'm going to give you the 9 lessons they shared with us, and then I'll have a link to the report at the end where we have a lot more information. And so some of these I think are pretty common sense. Others might surprise you. So first of all is just that a really strong multi-sector partnership was essential to this. They really needed, in order to stand up a program in a post-disaster environment, it had to move very quickly. And in order to do that, no one office or program had nearly the resources or expertise to do this. And so bringing together all of these different groups was really essential to their success. I would point out on this list of all of the organizations on the right, the one that maybe jumps out to me the most is Marshall ROC, which is the Restoring Our Community program. That is the long-term recovery group in the community. This is the citizens advocacy group. They didn't just keep their partnership among the government folks and the folks in the building industry. They also partnered directly with the organization that was most in touch with residents who were displaced from their homes to keep a constant communication with the needs of disaster survivors, which is really important in the post-disaster environment. A lot of programs fail because they sort of miss the mark with survivors. This conversation helped guarantee that the program was constantly adjusting based on the situation of the moment. Lesson two is that they really leveraged hard their existing programs. Rather than building a new infrastructure up from the ground, they leaned into an existing rebate program that Xcel Energy already had. And in order to do that, they basically were just able to pump up the amount of the rebates, but all of the delivery infrastructure was there in terms of signing households up, making sure that the inspections happens, getting the incentive checks out in the mail, doing the evaluation, all of that was already there. And so within 3 months of the fire, they had this entirely new program stood up with no additional administrative structures. They really found that to be effective. They also found that homeowners were able to access these incentives through very familiar channels, which in their energy bill, they got a notice about this program. That really helped raise the awareness very fast. After a disaster, any of you who've been through one know this, there's so much information flying at households, it's very easy for them to miss key pieces of information. This really helped get this program in front of people very early on and really were able to get good saturation in terms of people's knowledge about it. Lesson number three, and this is probably the most important lesson, is that the financial incentives made a big difference. They were large enough to grab people's attention, and we have a bunch of interesting quotes in our article we talked to contractors and we talked to other folks, and they talked about, yeah, with the usual incentives that are really small, we just grab them with stuff we're going to do anyway, and we just use them because they're there. These incentives actually change people's behavior. They would have done things differently had these incentives not existed. And so it really helped to get past the free rider problem and get towards true change in the way that people were rebuilding. And that then impacted the whole rebuilding sector, because once, there's probably only 20 or 30 contractors working across all of these homes. These are all in subdivisions. Once one contractor or two contractors came on board, the knowledge about the program started to spread and the comfort level with it began to spread. And I think you saw a big knock-on effect. And so the big part of that was the incentives helped people get over that initial hump and get them very interested in the program. It's probably a very good question. Well, where did those incentives come from? I'm happy to talk more about that later, but it was a combination of the utility coming in and providing resources, but also the state legislature stepping in and helping make this part of their overall recovery package. When you add it all up, it's not a terribly huge amount of money, but I do think that there's some lessons there about not trying to go at the lowest incentive possible, because it may not do much beyond like people who are already going to do that rebuilding, accessing that resource, which doesn't really change the curve at all. All right, lesson four, not just the size of the incentives, but also the structure of the incentives really mattered. And this was both on the positive side and also the lessons learned side. They designed this program to send the incentive to the homeowners rather than the contractor, which is different than many of the other electricity incentives and other parts of the sort of everyday life in Colorado. And the reason they wanted to do that was to sort of put the homeowner in the driver's seat and really make them excited about bringing that incentive to different contractors that they were shopping for their rebuild and having the contractors sort of competing for that incentive between themselves. They really do think that helped educate homeowners and create a demand for higher energy rebuilding. Where it was difficult was that it put a lot of the responsibility on the shoulders of homeowners, which is not great in a post-disaster environment. People are traumatized. They have a lot of things going on in their mind. It's difficult to take that on in addition to other things. And so I think most of the folks we talked to would probably do things slightly differently in the future, probably bringing builders in earlier in the process and creating more of a sort of split incentive where, yes, the homeowners are still involved, but the builders are coming on board earlier and becoming more educated as well. Number five, there were some really interesting stories about jurisdictional differences. Because this fire was spread across three different local governments, like many disasters do not stop at jurisdictional lines. They all had to be sort of on the same page about this program because if they weren't, they were going to have constituents saying that the program was unfair because these people over here are getting this and I'm not, and why not? One specific example of that was Boulder County out in the county actually had higher energy standards anyway. And so at first they were not, people, if they just rebuilt to code, were rebuilding to the first tier, the $7,500 tier. And originally the design was not to give those people the $7,500 incentive because they're just rebuilding to code. That turned out to pretty quickly to feel very unfair to people. Why are they, it creates a very perverse incentive where why would I rebuild to a higher code if I'm being penalized for it? And so they ultimately changed their program to give that incentive automatically to many of those Boulder County households. But it led to this bigger lesson about making sure that you have good collaboration between the different jurisdictions so that you don't create sort of artificial competition or feelings of unfairness between different voters. Lesson six was uncertainty, and we heard this probably more than anything else from our interviews, including with a lot of elected officials. Uncertainty is a critical barrier to sustainable rebuilding and can kill a program like this. And maybe not surprisingly, there was some pretty quick action on behalf of I don't know the right way to describe them. I will describe them as actors who did not have great intentions, who wanted to sort of cast doubt on this program because they were hoping to come in and rebuild very quickly to the lowest standard and sort of maximize, minimize the amount of time they had to spend and maximize the amount of work they could get. And they started to cast doubt on the cost of this program and how much it was going to cost to implement. And that created a ton of uncertainty in the community, which really affected the people who designed this program and the amount of communication that they had to do. And so the advice that they give is to really lock down, like we just heard about Louisville, right? We're locking down the numbers with careful study, trusted study partners. We're putting that information out into the public and we're defending those numbers publicly early and often as really key. And so an example of this is the I'll call them not great actors were circulating this idea that it was actually going to cost 70 to 100,000 to rebuild your homes to this amount. So yes, you get an incentive for 20,000, but you're going to end up paying 80,000 out of pocket. The actual resulting cost after 3 years, it turns out was 6 to 22,000. So many of the homeowners actually profited off of the incentive. It covered the entire cost of the rebuild to higher energy standards, which is what the government expected from the very beginning. And so you can see this key difference. But at the time, and from the perspective of the homeowner, they were hearing these two different messages and didn't know who to trust. And that became a really important challenge. Lesson seven, this was one of the sort of, if there was any regrets among the folks who designed this program, is that they did not really think about whether you want to call it equity, whether you want to call it fairness, whether you want to just think about it as having sort of program access. They had the same rebate for everybody, no matter who you were. If you were wealthy, if you were low income, if you were a multi-generational homeowner, if you were, it didn't matter who you were, the incentives were exactly the same. They really think that if they were to do it again in the future, they may not change the incentives per se, but they would try to reduce some of the upfront costs for people who have less wealth. Because, like many incentives, these are rebates. And so it still requires you to put money on the, cash on the barrelhead to do these things before you get your money back. Well, that's more challenging for someone who may not have a large savings account. They may not have as good of insurance. They may be really underinsured. They would redesign the program to allow some group of people who are financially challenged to be able to access maybe these programs as a grant rather than a rebate in order to make the program a little bit more inclusive. And again, they're still collecting the data on who did and did not recover. But the key fact here is that most of these homeowners were relatively well off. If the exact same disaster were to happen in a lower income neighborhood, they would probably have to change the design of the program, or they would have a much lower rate of people participating. And then lastly, or maybe second to last, one of the key messages that came out of this was that the message that you lead with really, really matters. This is, if you talk with these folks who are in this office, they are like the Office of Energy and Sustainability and Resilience. They are all about the environmental impacts, the environmental benefits, resilience, sustainability, net zero energy. they said that they went out with that message and it completely fell flat with with the people who are rebuilding. And these are very climate progressive people. What people wanted to hear was how great their house was going to be. Their house was going to be super efficient, super comfortable, super X, Y, and Z. And they basically said you had to get people excited about the prospect of rebuilding. They completely changed their messaging midstream because they realized that all the things that got them excited as clean energy professionals is not what gets a disaster survivor excited about rebuilding to a passive energy standard. They want to hear about how awesome their home is going to be and how great this opportunity is for them. And that was a huge lesson that they learned. And then lastly, they're just saying preparation is key. They wish they would have started all of this earlier. They could have had this program set up and then had it sort of on the shelf ready to go when the disaster happened. They didn't, but they basically said, hey, all of you out there, this is the actual quote. Don't reinvent the wheel. Take everything we did, steal it, bring it over to your jurisdiction and use it yourselves. Do whatever you want to do with it. Go to our website and take all of it. It's for you. And so they're just encouraging everyone out there to do this program also. And I think that's exactly 20 minutes, according to my timer. But the full report here called Rebuilding Better After the Marshall Fire is available on the Urban Institute website. And like I said, that's a collaboration between us and the Boulder County Office of Sustainability, Climate Action, and Resilience. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Andy. We have a few questions in the chat I'd love to throw your way. The first one is, were the concerns about the upfront costs to rebuild to the new code valid? Has a comparative study been conducted related to that?
Yes. So, and kind of putting yourself back in the shoes of at the time, you have 1,300 homes destroyed. You have this huge supply shock coming out of COVID. You also have Colorado. If anyone knows the Front Range, it's one of the highest growth regions of the country. And so you also just have a really constrained supply of like contractors and construction firms and everything else. And so there was a lot of uncertainty around, anytime, like the same thing is happening in Los Angeles right now. Construction costs, they're going to be higher than normal times. You just don't know how high. But the local governments actually all came together and commissioned a study to ask what rebuilding to those higher standards would cost, and they thought it was going to be in that 5 to 25,000 range, depending on the home and the layout and the customization and everything else. They were really confident of those, but the public backlash was so strong. And we interviewed for a separate project. We interviewed all the elected officials. They said, even though I believed in our numbers, I had to make the other choice because the public was so adamant about it. I think that the number I showed you where it came in right between 6 and 22,000, and that's based on real data from real reconstruction. They were right all along that that's what it was actually going to cost. Again, it's not to say that uncertainty didn't come from a good place with homeowners. They were just trying to make sure that they weren't going to get caught in a rebuilding trap where they couldn't afford to finish and they would have to move. But maybe a little piece of evidence that things worked out for the better than they thought. We're tracking the size of homes being rebuilt through this whole area, and the average home is being rebuilt to about 10 or 15% higher square footage. And so people clearly had a little bit extra left in their budget than they thought they would. And so people are actually building slightly larger than they would have their original footprint, which I think says something about the recovery ended up being more cost efficient than the pessimist would have said.
Who did the study that you mentioned? Who conducted that?
I'm sorry, the original one about the cost estimate.
Yeah.
It's on the Louisville and Superior website. It was an energy construction consulting firm in the Front Range that specializes in these kind of questions.
Okay.
And they do, I forget off the top, it's like Dynamics or something like that. But this is basically what they do, is study these kind of questions.
Great. Thank you. I'm going to there's a two-parter here, question I'm going to do next. Did Xcel have to get Public Utility Commission approval to change its programs, or did the existing utility program work? And then the second part is, did Xcel get partial and proportional credit for the program net energy savings?
So that's actually a great question. I actually don't know. I'd be happy to follow up with that with our Xcel partner. That's a great question. I believe, I'll speak this, I'm not a utility expert. There, like I said, the state legislature passed a companion piece of legislation that created a fund to help support some of this. And I don't know if it was in that bill that I'll follow up,
Okay.
but I do know that Excel was able to move fairly quickly, but they had strong political support from the get-go for that.
Okay, great. Yeah. I guess my last quick question is, what advice do you have in terms of, the transferability of, if you're working in a less progressive, jurisdiction, less progressive environmental policies, code policies, what advice do you have in terms of the lessons learned here in this case study for folks on the call?
I mean, from my perspective, I've always said this, I think you can accomplish all the same things without ever saying the words climate or anything, right? Like you're
Yeah.
talking about energy standards, you're talking about home comfort, you're talking about a bunch of other things. I think that, these homes are not only going to be way less expensive to operate, they're also going to be more resilient to heat waves. I think programs like the fortified roof program that's spreading throughout the South right now, Alabama is the real leader on that. I think they're evidence that people with the right incentives and with the right people are very willing to upgrade their homes and it's not necessarily, yes, it has climate benefits, but really it's all about saving the consumer some money and building a better house. And I think that even in this place, that became the key message out of all of this was not that like we save so much carbon emissions. It became that all of these homeowners have better homes with better energy envelopes, and they also are saving money every month. And I think for that reason, it was a pretty successful program. The government can then use it towards their own emissions goals.
That's great. Thank you. And I wondered, Andy, if I could ask you to drop the website that you mentioned, because I don't have that one on my list, but I'll drop your Urban Institute website in a second. But we're going to have to move on to our next speaker. But I really appreciate your time, and thanks to the crowd for the great questions as well. And I don't think we're going to have time to come back around. We're running a little bit behind this morning, but we will get answers to questions. We'll coordinate with the speakers and either post those on our BRESE website, or we'll send those in our follow-up email to folks. But I'm going to pass it back to Justin. Thanks so much, Andy, for being here today.